go. Okay, so we are live on Facebook streaming as well, in keeping with our policy of open access and free open access to all uh, members and non-members as well. So I guess we can start. It's 8:30 in India, 8 uh, 8:30 in India, and it's 10 p.m. in Mexico City, from where we are hosting this inaugural conference. Welcome, welcome to the Rupkatha International Open Access Conference 2020. First of all, let me wish you all good health and a safe and happy time ahead of you in the next few months following the emergence of this pandemia worldwide. Rupkatha, as you know, has for the first time organized a seminar on this level. The journal has evolved for more than 10 years from a fledgling academic effort to be one of the most recognized journals in humanities, especially in Asia. The conference should add a new dimension to its activities. Henceforth, Rupkatha shall create a non-profit platform to give voice to humanists and activists around the world. Today, participants from more than 12 countries and 5 continents are joining the Rupkatha platform to discuss literature, arts, education, sciences, and culture, and to create opinion and influence and be part of a fabric. We have to define that fabric. We are happy that the august presence of Dr. Abdul, JanMohamed, and Dr. Albrecht Classen are showing us the directions that would reflect on the human condition, that would help us evolve and impact upon our environment immediately and for the future. I extend a warm welcome to the inaugural speakers and the distinguished board members of Rupkatha, who comprise a team of reference, advice, information, and enrichment. We are proud to host the speakers on this platform. They are teachers and research fellows whose free thinking, independent opinion, whose decisions regarding the texts that they choose to read and the manner in which they seek to interpret it and uphold certain values would shape the opinion of the coming generations. Welcome to the inauguration of the Rupkatha Conference 2020. I wish all of you all the best for your presentations. I'm now glad to extend a warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, Dr. Abdul, JanMohamed, University of California, Berkeley, and Dr. Albrecht Classen, University of Arizona, Tucson. We shall begin by inviting Dr. Abdul, JanMohamed to deliver our inaugural speech and define the thematic context for the crisis in humanities, education, social and political economy that threatens us at this point of time in this world of pandemic, and to seek relevant and effective lines of thinking. Dr. JanMohamed is undoubtedly the most powerful post-colonial intellectual theorist of the contemporary academy. Born in 1945 in Kenya, Abdul, JanMohamed is the most perceptive critic who has been writing since the early 1980s. He was born and raised in Kenya and educated in Britain and the USA, receiving his PhD from Brandeis University. Since 1982, he has taught in the English department of the University of California, Berkeley. And has also been the Longstreet Professor of English at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. His most important single author publication include Manichaean Aesthetics, The Politics of Literature in Colonial Africa, which was published in 1983, for which he was awarded the Choice Book of the Year Award in 1984. His other crucial work is The Death-Bound Subject, Richard Wright's Archaeology of Death, published in 2005. Professor JanMohamed considers racial lynching as the most fundamental mode of coercion. It has been said about his writings that should African American studies continue in its pursuit of rendering the vagaries of death intellectually legible, the field should turn to Manichaean Aesthetics as a book and one of its signal events. Abdul JanMohamed develops a Marxian phenomenology with which he deconstructs the feelings of marginalized protagonists who, faced with the threat of death by lynching, begin to contemplate the effectivities of that threat on their subjectivities. He shows that the threat of death activates what he calls the death drive out of a negative dialectics, produced in subjects irremediably trapped between two levels, two cultures, two planes across the frontier. We are proud to have Professor Abdul JanMohamed for the Rupkatha seminar. This is a glorious moment for our journal, which also wants to offer him tribute from a land to which he has his deepest moorings. Abdul, more than any other critic in the last 50 years, has shown how we should think about life and its inescapable polarities and the threat of death across which conflicts defy to resolve themselves. I now invite Professor Abdul JanMohamed to deliver his inaugural address for the Rupkatha International Conference 2020. Thank you so much.
Okay, I just unmuted myself. So thank you very much, Tirtha, and the board and the members of the board of the journal and everybody else who's put in the effort to organize this virtual conference. This is my first experience really dealing with Zoom. In about a week, I have to start teaching via Zoom, and I'm not looking forward to it. But let me get to the issues that I think I want to talk about briefly. And that is, the title is the political economy of death, which then implies that there's a Marxian influence here, that there is some way in which we can map the use value, exchange value of life and death, the way Marx maps those for other areas, right? And I think Marx's mapping of economy has never been adequately appropriated by the humanities. So what I'm trying to suggest is that one of the fundamental problems we as a global human culture have is our refusal to recognize the power of death. Death is something we will try and push away in every way possible. We celebrate little children's birthdays, but there's no such thing as a death day that we can not necessarily celebrate, but at least acknowledge. And I give you two examples of this very, very profound denial of death. One is when I teach a class, undergraduate class, about this issue, I will start by tricking the students into some naive question about how many of you are graduating this year, and hands shoot up without any hesitation. They know when they're graduating. And then later in that same class, we talk about death, and I ask them a naive question: how many of you are going to die? Nobody puts up a hand, right? And I say, well, I wait. I said, nobody's gonna die? I mean, are you really not gonna die? And after coercing them for like 3 or 4 minutes, finally a few hands go up, and then by the end of 5 minutes, everybody's putting their hand up. And I'm very persistent about pushing them. And my point in doing that is simply to say that there are two kinds of knowledge that surround the issue of death. Unlike the graduation issue, which is an intellectual form of knowledge, we know certainly when we're going to graduate. Death is not just working on that level. Intellectually, we all know we're going to die, but emotionally, we don't want to acknowledge that, and hence the hesitation, right? So that's a way of launching that. But a more substantive way of talking about the denial of death is to look very, very briefly at the three major monotheistic religions, all coming out of the Middle East, all highly patriarchal structures. And what all three of them have in common, in spite of all their variations, is that at the end of life, you are offered a bargain. If you don't want to die, believe in what we tell you, believe in our God, and do everything as we tell you to do, and we will guarantee that you going to heaven will not die anymore. In other words, death will be abolished for you if you are a true believer, right? All three religions are very powerful in that instance. And I think that that's the most powerful index we have of our need to deny death. Pantheistic religions, as in Indian culture, have a notion of reincarnation, which may be a variation on the theme. If you are reincarnated, you're never quite going to die. It's a complicated issue. But what I want to emphasize is that this denial of death is very, very dangerous. And for the world culture, climatically and otherwise, we are on the edge of a precipice that I think is controlled by death and our denial of death. But I would like to begin this more by looking at the theories that I've developed, and other people have too, around the question of slavery and the slave's refusal or not refusal, his recognition of the fact of death. And where I begin with is the notion that you cannot enslave anybody if that person is not afraid to die. In other words, my capacity to enslave you is dependent on your fear of dying. And my capacity to enslave you is also dependent on my ability to persuade you that if you don't do what I do, I will kill you. So it is our attachment to life and our fear of death that allows us to be turned into slaves in some form or the other. And if you look at the narrative, slave narratives from Frederick Douglass through Richard Wright in the Jim Crow Society, through Martin Luther King and Gandhi behind Martin Luther King and Steve Biko in South Africa, what you begin to see is that the threat of death is in effect a two-sided coin. On the one side of the coin is the threat. My threat as a master to the slave, saying, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'll kill you. I'll coerce you in various ways, but if those ways fail, ultimately I'll just kill you. That only works if the slave is afraid to die. If the slave is not afraid to die, if the slave responds by saying, fine, kill me, I'm not going to be a slave. I can kill him, I can kill many, many potential slaves, but I can never enslave them unless they're willing to say, don't kill me, I will be a slave. So what I'm arguing is that at the core of slavery, and then this applies to capitalism as well, there is a contract, there's an unconscious contract between the master and the slave. The unconscious contract is the master allows the slave to live from day to day on the condition that the slave do his bidding for everything in every way. And whenever that contract is broken by the slave, he can be lynched. And the most dramatic example in early slave narratives of this is in Frederick Douglass's narrative, where when he's a young boy, he sees a slave who is being whipped and doesn't like being whipped, he runs off into a stream and on an understanding that the overseer will not follow him. And the overseer does not want to go and get himself wet. So he goes to the edge of the stream, pulls out his gun, and he says, I'm going to count to 3. If you don't come out, I'll kill you. And maybe the slave doesn't believe him, but the overseer does pull out the gun and kill him. And at the inquest, which the master holds because slave is valuable property, you don't want to kill them, the overseer says, look, every once in a while, you've got to kill one of them. Otherwise, they will never believe that you're going to kill them. When slavery is ended and Jim Crow society, form of racism, takes over, lynching becomes even more prominent. That was under slavery. In the Deep South, the 6 states, on the average, in the 1920s and 30s, there were 52 people lynched every year, 1 a week. And that was necessary to keep the Black population under control. Testimony we have from somebody like Richard Wright, who grows up in Jackson, Mississippi at this period, and who says when he's about 11, when an older brother of his friend is lynched, that he feels that day as if he were the victim of 1,000 lynchings. And what I argue in my book on Richard Wright is that Wright's psyche is totally permeated by the threat of death and the possibility of death. And this is not, and then that everything he writes thereafter is dealing with how to overcome what I call death-bound subjectivity. And that's paradoxical in that your life is bound. Life is the process of binding for Freud. In this case, life is bound by the threat of death, by the threat of unbinding. And how deeply that permeates Wright can be illustrated by one very simple incident out of the early pages of his autobiography. The first incident he talks about in his autobiography is that he accidentally, but deliberately, burns down his grandmother's house. Second incident is that his father tells him to get rid of a kitten that has come in the yard because it's making too much noise. He says, get rid of him. I don't care. Just get rid of it. Richard Wright lynches that kitten and then uses the lynching to argue to his father that he has no further moral authority over him. I did what you asked me to do. I killed the kitten on your command. And there goes his moral authority. And Wright, I want to say, is not an aberration. People who've done research in this area, one of the things they find remarkable is that these lynchings, 1 a week in that whole area, were festivals. And school children were schools were closed so that children could attend the lynchings. And that was known, but what some of the researchers found astounding is that there were white mothers then writing letters to the editor, various newspapers, saying, we've got to stop this because my daughter Sally went to a lynching the other day and she just tried to lynch her younger brother, right? So it permeates not just Richard Wright, but every human being in that context. Make a very quick segue to Steve Biko for a minute. Biko's last essay is called Simply on Death. And it's a part of a talk. And he was asked, what will happen to you when they arrest you next? Because, they just arrested some of your friends and they killed them. They tortured them to death. And Biko says, yes, I know. I think that's going to happen to me too. And then he has a disquisition on death. And he says, look, if I'm afraid to die, then the battle's lost already. then I might as well pack up my tent and stop protesting and stop fighting. Because it's my fear of death that allows them to have this power over me. If I'm not afraid to die, they can kill me, but they can never enslave me. And it's a fascinating a piece of work that he articulates, weeks before his death. They did come and take him. They tortured him to death, broke every bone in his body. What I find remarkable then is not just that radicals like Steve Biko see that very clearly, but in the American context, Martin Luther King saw that very, very clearly as well. What I think is one of the most powerful speeches that he makes is not the one, I Have a Dream, which is fabulous, but the last speech, which says, I've been to the mountaintop and I met my maker. And I know I'm going to die because the FBI has warned him, somebody's going to try and kill you. And they're in effect saying, we're going to kill you. And he says, fine, if you're going to kill me, that's it. But I'm not going to back off. And, sometime close thereafter, he is in fact killed. The other most remarkable use of this, the twisting around of death as a form of rebellion is, of course, Gandhi. King learned a lot from Gandhi about civil rights and nonviolence and so on and so forth. And I think he learned something from Gandhi about death too. But Gandhi goes one step further. He not only says, I'm willing to die for my cause, I can commit suicide by starvation, right? Go on a hunger strike. And pretty soon he realizes that if he does that, people back off, the colonialists in this case. And soon he begins to use his threat of death against the colonialists. And in fact, where the master says, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'll kill you, Gandhi turns it around and says, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'll kill myself. And that, of course, only works when he has enormous cultural capital. If you and I did that, nobody would care probably. But behind somebody like Gandhi, it really does work. So these are the kinds of incidents, backgrounds, texts from which I begin to develop a general kind of theory. And just a couple of more mentions here. The Black feminist tradition in America, of course, does not have that kind of heroic thing like Douglass and Wright do, but they have a much more powerful, a different form of heroism. And that is the question around Black motherhood and slavery. And most of you probably know that Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, is based on a real life story of Margaret Garner, a slave who escaped with her family, was captured by the slaves again, and said that before she would allow her children to be, and herself to be taken back into slavery, she would rather kill them all. And she does succeed in killing one, and they stop her from killing the rest. And then that becomes a humongous trial because the abolitionists try to use that by way of saying you can only try her for murder if you admit that her child was not chattel. You can only murder a human being, and so on and so forth. So, and Toni Morrison then takes that and writes the most magnificent novel around a mother's love that is so powerful that she, in the name of her love, is willing to kill her child rather than let it go back into slavery. And if those of you who read Beloved will know that it is a brilliant text, not only that in that it contextualizes goes into the content of life versus death. Mother brings the child into life and has the right to take it away, or not perhaps. Content-wise, it's a brilliant novel, but stylistically, it's also brilliant, I think, because it is a novel that I think I found is the most difficult novel to read in my life, because Morrison takes you into the life, the mind of the mother as she is killing the child. And you have these slow motion versions of the mother using a saw blade on the child's throat, but doing it in as loving a way as possible, doing it in order to avoid pain for the child. And so the novel is written in such a way that I think is the most beautiful novel ever written, and yet it's the most painful as well. And so it's this intersection of life and death that Black feminists have captured around the question of slavery. I think this carries over into capitalism. The factory worker is in effect bound by the capitalist rules that say you work for me for the wages, the pittance that I pay you, just enough for you to reproduce your labor, your strength from one day to the next. There's not going to be any extra here for you to save or do better for yourself in life. And if you don't like this bargain, go find a job elsewhere. So in other words, in effect, the capitalism holds the worker on the edge of death, just as slavery does. The other part of this is that in modern day world, slavery hasn't disappeared. There are 40 million slaves in the world today, according to some estimations. And unfortunately, a bulk of them are in Southeast Asian countries, right? And so forth. So that, then there's a question of debt slavery, paramount in many cultures. I had a student who did a brilliant essay once when we were talking about this, and I was asking him to talk about modern day slavery, and he wrote an essay on debt card debt as a form of slavery, and looked at how deeply people get indebted to debt cards with interest going up to 25, 30, 40%. And that just sucks your life out, that you already signed a contract in effect. We could talk about the untouchability issue as a form of slavery, and variations on untouchability exist in all kinds of cultures. I would say basically that in these days of the coronavirus, we hear a lot about people who live hand to mouth. And people who live hand to mouth are ubiquitous in the world. The vast majority of the people live from hand to mouth. And when they do, if I want to exploit them, have enormous amounts of power to appropriate their labor for my profit and give them a pittance so they will live till the next day. So all of that is kind of by way of background for what I want to say. I think I'm running out of time. So I'll try and conclude the rest of it quickly, so there's time for discussion. So basically,
you have
sure.
You have a good deal of time left, 10 minutes, 15 minutes.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. All right. So what I'm arguing then is basically there's very little difference between slavery and capitalism when it comes to using the threat of death to siphon off extra value from life and accumulate that value, right? And I think one can make a comparison between religions, the monotheistic religions that I mentioned before, and capitalism. The monotheistic religions say to the Christian or the Muslim or whatever it is, in order to be a true Christian and Muslim, you have to give us a tithe. So that's one tax to start with. But other than that, you have to live in the way we tell you to live. You know, if you want life hereafter, you have to do what we want you to do. And what is it that they get you to do? They get you to build humongous, fabulous cathedrals and mosques, right? So death, the threat of death is used to produce erotic monuments. Taj Mahal is the most contradictory structure of that kind, right? What capitalism does is a similar kind of thing. It holds you at the edge of death, and it siphons off your value, the value of your production, of your labor. And unlike religion, or like religion, but in a very different kind of way, capitalism works out a way of accumulating the value of your labor and your life, right? And elsewhere, I've talked about life as labor being both erotic, being both structures of eros and being identical in a way. What capitalism does is that it finds a way of transferring value into a form in which it can be stored forever. and that being stored forever, I mean, mainly monetary currency, accounting, allows you to accumulate wealth that does not spoil, that can be kept and can grow forever and ever and ever. And that infinite growth of value, I would say, is the equivalent of going to heaven and not having to die, right? That's psychologically, the deep level, is a powerful motivating factor for the accumulation of wealth. And as with the religions, it uses this wealth to build all kinds of erotic monuments, and it invests those profits in accumulating further wealth from labor and from nature. Now, I think colonialism has to be brought into the equation, because I see colonialism here as existing at the intersection of slavery and capitalism. It's a transitional form between slavery and capitalism, if you will. So the acquisition of land in Africa by European powers, Kenya, for example, is the acquisition of land, but also of labor. The natives are pushed off their land, and they're forced into a monetary political economy. And in Manichaean aesthetics, I do a whole chapter on how complicated the force enforcement structure has to become to get people who never offered labor as a commodity on the market for sale to begin to think about labor as a commodity and offer it for sale. It's a major transformation that takes place under colonialism. And then, of course, there's slavery too, which takes labor and puts it in land which is being cleared of other indigenous populations, and so on and so forth. So it's a double movement there that I think illustrates for me that the march of acquisition, the appropriation of life, which includes labor, but it also includes various forms of nature, like growing food, for example, right? I mean, that's all structure part of what Freud would call eros. And it transforms eros into this dead profit, dead value. And I think we have allowed that structure to take us over to the point where we are now facing an ecological disaster. And that is because capitalism is relentless in its rape of nature, which includes human beings. They are expendable. Nature is expendable in order to create and accumulate dead value. I will just briefly mention the psychoanalytic side of this, because I talk about eros and thanatos, ideas that come from Freud. And thanatos, the death drive, people are being very, very skeptical. But I would say very, very briefly that we have to bracket the way Freud tried to explain and justify the death drive. I don't think that works. But we have from contemporary biology an understanding that our bodies consist of both the life drive and the death drive. Our cells are constantly reproducing themselves, restructuring each organ so it continues to function well, right? That's built into our DNA. But what's also built into our DNA is the telomeres at the end of the chromosome, which determines how many times that cell can reproduce itself. And when it runs out of those reproductive numbers, it just dies. And what happens in old age? So our bodies are structured to reproduce and thrive, to reproduce life, biologically speaking, but they're also structured to die off in the end. And I think those two forces are inside us biologically, but also psychologically, and they create humongous struggles within themselves. I mean, the contradictions of life and death. Don't have too much time to get into the details of that, except, again, if you read a novel like Beloved, I think you see the political economy and the psychoanalytic structures of life and death coming together in a very powerful way. Let me just mention one aspect of this struggle between life and death. And that is what Lacan calls the corpse morcelé, the body in pieces. And he says that the body in pieces is the underlying unconscious experience of all of us. And that is a form of death. The body in pieces is the experience, he says, of the child before the child is able to integrate himself or herself into a coherent being. The child flails around. It can't crawl, it can't walk, it can't look after itself. None of its bodies are under its control. It's just hands flailing around. And that's what he means by the body in pieces. And he says that we're constantly haunted by our own bodies returning to that state in the unconscious level. And popular culture, I think, will verify that very clearly, because there are so many cultural items, literature, films, et cetera, that are repeatedly fascinated by human characters, by bodies that are blown up, right? And that bodies that are blown up and then come back together again in a science fiction kind of setting. And that is our rehearsal of death at a cultural level as well. Finally, I would say we need to acknowledge death in a way that we never have. And that it's only when we can begin to do so in a very serious, existential, Zen Buddhist kind of way, acknowledge death as a reality of our everyday life, that we can begin to become free. One of the things I find fascinating today is the number of teachers who are now being forced to go back to teach. They're going back to teach in very anxious ways, to junior schools and so on and so forth. The number of them who say, okay, I just made my will before I start teaching, because I may die because I go to teach. And because I may die, that clarifies my head. I need to put my life in order and make a will. I think the whole COVID, this coronavirus phenomena is an occasion which wakes us up to our own mortality. But that has to become, I think, a practice, not something we can talk about and then forget. If we celebrate for children their birthdays every year, what would a culture be like if that culture, after celebrating the birthday of a 13-year-old, would ask that child a week later to celebrate or to sit and think about his or her own death? That someday I'm going to die. And what Heidegger says is, we don't know when that's going to happen. It could be tomorrow. I could die crossing a road. I could die by a heart attack in the middle of my next sentence, and so on and so forth. And if you see it that way, then every day you live is your last day, by definition. And if it is your last day, you're back to the teacher who says, wait a minute, I got to take stock of my life. So I think death needs to be brought to consciousness in some fashion, so that it does not allow, how should I put this, so that it's not able to milk the rest of the life for everything that it's worth and turn it into dead value. So let me stop there. It's a very condensed kind of theoretical thing, and I think in keeping with the name of the journal, you might want to think of it as a fairy tale, as a mythological tale of some kind.
Thank you, Dr. Abdul JanMohamed, for that fascinating analysis of death, for implanting that consciousness of death once again back in the middle of our lives. And that's something like it reminds us of that prevalent European emblem of death as a character who lives and walks along our sides every day of our lives, and that the folk imagination through the entire medieval era had tried to negotiate with death, to play the game of chess with death, and it's fascinating in the way we think about death on those very intensely, powerfully emotional days of the Dia del Muertos, the Day of the Dead, and the day of the Tarpana, of homage to the ancestors, and how death, when it is woven into the fabric of our lives, will give us a sense of life which is far more different from the kind of life that we witness on television from day to day. Thank you, Dr. Professor Abdul JanMohamed. That was just a divine exposition. Thank you so much for making this effort of Rupkatha so unique, and your exposition just turns this conference seminar into a message for all aspiring educationists, for all aspiring teachers and researchers. And so I don't have words enough to thank you. But of course, your presentation today reminds me and brings me to the other great presenter that we have, and the range and the depth of scholarship that he displays in his paper, which he has already sent to me to my email, and I was quite spellbound to retrace those images, to retrace my steps back to the images of the emblematic figure of death. Dr. Albrecht Classen, University Distinguished Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of German Studies at the University of Arizona. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Classen. Dr. Classen studied at the universities of Marburg, Erlangen, Millersville, Pennsylvania, Oxford, Salamanca, Spain, Italy, Charlottesville, Virginia. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia in 1986. Dr. Classen has published more than 105 scholarly books, critical editions, translations, textbooks. At the latest count, he has published 710 scholarly articles and 2,600 book reviews. He's the editor of the journal Medievalistik and Humanities, which is open access online, and also the review editor of Translit 2. In 2004, Dr. Classen received the Federal Cross of Merit, the Bundesverdienstkreuz Award from the Federal Republic of Germany, an award which he considered to be the most valuable recognition of his life's works, and one which moved him to tears, as he says, and an award which made his father say that he was doing something valuable after all for humanity. In the spring of 2012, Dr. Classen received the award of the Outstanding Academic Title for his Handbook of Medieval Studies, which was published in 2010 and awarded by Choice Current Reviews for Academic Libraries. So we are proud to have Dr. Classen speak on the traditions of poetry, mostly arising out of the medieval Christian world, as an answer to the presence of death within enclosed societies. Paradigmatically, the conflict with death situation evokes an emblematic memory of the situation in our current world, and one which has not changed in its essence from the medieval world. Yet it is a world which has lost the strategic ethos, concurrent with the doctrinal ethnopathos and its triumphant colors in the real world, and an attitude that makes human existence so persevering and defiant forever through the consciousness of death. Dr. Albrecht Classen, I welcome you and I invite you to deliver your precious keynote speech for the conference.
Well, Tirtha, thank you so much. Can you all hear me well? Does the sound work? Okay, very good. I'm very thankful for this invitation that I can give a keynote lecture here. It's a very interesting and wonderful opportunity. If you think about what COVID-19 has done to us, you can come up with thousands of negative points, but there are also positive things. That's always very strange in terms of philosophy, that negatives often also lead over to positives because they force us to think much more about ourselves, who we are, what our purposes are. And so Dr. JanMohamed, very thank you much for bringing to our attention the notion that freedom and death are so closely related. So I never would have had a chance to listen to you without this conference. So I'm very grateful to the organizers, to the journal, and to the whole organization. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so let me open that up. I will share my screen, and that should just work fine. And so, can you all see it? I think you can all see it now, right? Very good. So my title is In Defiance of the Pandemic, the Poetic Word. Yes, I mean poetry now. I was just interviewed actually today by a radio station where they asked me a little bit about how one can maintain one's sanity and ultimately also one's sense of happiness and identity in the current climate. And I thought very hard and very quickly about the enormous power of human creativity. And I think that in the entire field of humanities, that is our greatest strength, that we really provide means of expression, ideas, concepts, notions, maybe also dreams for people to live. And as I want to present today, although poetry for many people in the world maybe might no longer be so attractive, it really proves to be one of the most powerful expressions in human life. I'm a medievalist mostly, but I want to provide you with a wide range of different materials. I probably will run out of time because the material is so infinite, but if I at least can address a couple of major points and then rush through to the end of my presentation, I would be very delighted. So Tirtha, if you just maybe can keep a watch a little bit so that I don't go over my time.
Okay.
So thank you very much. I will address now this topic and want to talk about a very interesting contrast. You could say that the world of the Middle Ages was all poetry. Actually, if you go further back, the ancient world and let's say the world prior to Rome and Greek antiquity, or the world of non-literate cultures, it's all poetry. They all sing. And throughout the Middle Ages, virtually every text apart from laws and maybe philosophy and theology, all were expressed, you could say, with music. Why? I will come to that a little bit later, but just for now, the contrast seems to be that we live very much in a world of prose. And so there seems to be a strong contrast between, on the one hand, poetry and prose on the other hand. And you could say poetry is the enchantment of the world, whereas prose is the disenchantment of the world. Whether all that is so true, it is a big question that I would like to explore further with you. So my big question is then today, is there still poetry? And if so, why? And what do we do with this? Who cares about poetry? And what might be its purpose? From a historical perspective, poetry has always been around, has always been considered to be the most important expression. If you think about Homer, if you think about Dante, if you think about Emily Dickinson, and countless other great poets throughout times. Of course, in our modern world, money and politics matter much, much more and seem to be very contradictory to poetry. Poetry seems to be the most fleeting, ephemeral, irrelevant mode of expression, while I would like to argue, particularly in light of COVID-19, that might be an error and we can maybe come back to really the core issues of human life by way of poetry. Now, in economic terms, most publishing houses today are very reticent and or hesitant to publish anything in terms of poetry because they know they cannot sell poetry well. Poetry is no longer really taught in general in schools or at the universities, and I think there's a general resistance against anything that has to do with poetry for lots of different reasons. And it has a lot to do also with sort of the interesting, maybe ideological notion of the Western world since maybe 1800 is sort of a disenchanted world, whereas non-Western world has a much stronger interest still in poetry. Whether all that's true, that is a big question, but I would like to probe further. The question that I'm addressing is also, in essence, the question pertaining to the relevance of the humanities and the arts. We live, of course, in very serious economic crisis, and many people might say, why would we need the humanities? Now we need really try to preserve our economies, whereas in reality, the opposite is the case, I would argue, because without us being as human beings and understanding what we are as human beings, we will very quickly become victims of complete and total digitization and robotization. And so we need really to probe, particularly in this day and age of pandemic, what we are as human beings and how we can find this expressed. I would like to argue that in a certain way, poetry is a global communication system because it, even if you do not understand the words, for example, of a poem, you still can get a sense of the musicality behind it. And by way of music, people have been able to communicate across cultures, across genders, across races, across all kinds of other categories. More strongly, I would like to push the argument that poetry is not just simply a form of expression, but it's also a form of translation. It translates our material existence into a spiritual existence, or rather, it allows us to remember that we're not only material, but we're also a spiritual being. It also allows us, I go to...
Life Milai music, music Milai life. You born to be free.
Sorry?
The Bluetooth device.
What is this? Okay, are you all good? I hope so. So
Yes, yes, tightly continue.
So poetry,
Yes, sir, kindly continue, sir.
I get a lot of...
Yes, please continue. Sorry about that.
Okay, and poetry is also one of the key tools to connect the individual to the community, or the nation or the people to the global network. Now, and this is a beautiful segue to the previous talk, so thank you very much. What do we do in terms of the humanities? We're looking at these fundamental issues. There is not much more. There's death, there's love, there's God, or the quest for God, there's a quest for the meaning of life, there's maybe also family, justice, and freedom, and all of that framed really by our sense of hope. If we don't have that, we are not really living. So I refer you to Alice Walker, who is the famous author of The Color Purple, which was also made into a movie. And in a very important study, she wrote about herself writing and came up with this wonderful statement that we need to live by the word and keep walking. So we live only if we have words, and we have only words if we have a form of music within us. So we have heard already also about Martin Luther King and his poem or his sermon, I Have a Dream. And I think that is a wonderful motto for all of us, because if we don't have a dream, we don't really live. And if we don't really have a dream, that we don't have music. And if we don't have music, we don't have poetry. So, but I don't want to argue that poetry is just a sort of a fun, nice, sweet thing that puts us to sleep. It's not just a lullaby, but rather poetry can also be, and many times has been, as we see in the case of Martin Luther King's poem, but also Bertolt Brecht and many, many other great poets all over the world. It can also provide us with tools for critical analysis. So sometimes, or many times, poetry also speaks a very harsh and very aggressive language, but provides us with very powerful expressions to address injustice, racism, colonialism. And so it is one of the most universal mediums to reach masses. I was shocked when I did the research for this paper to learn that in other parts of the world, such as in the United Arab Emirates, there's enormous popular interest in poetry. It's called The Millions Poet, and it's aired by the television network Abu Dhabi TV and the Millions Poet channel. They reported that they are sort of repeating or quoting or reactivating the ancient poetry of Nabati, Mal, Shala, and Kalta, and that's already since February 2014. They have millions and millions of viewers watching their young poets bringing back the old Arabic poetry and their own culture and their own identity. So poetry as a medium to create identity. I'm also very happy to tell you that, for example, at my own university, we have a very unique center. It's called the Poetry Center, which is privately funded, and it has a huge library. Lots of poets are coming here on a regular basis. So even in the West, there can be a very, very strong ways of looking at poetry as an essential corner or anchor of what we do. There's also in the United States, at least, the so-called Poet Laureate, and I have here listed the name of the one who founded that and the name of the current Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo, who is the United States Poet Laureate, and he's the first Native American Poet Laureate in the history of that position. So we are really changing, and poetry becomes almost also politics. The question then is, why would I say that poetry is also music? And I would like to refer you briefly to the, for me at least, the most influential philosopher we have had in late antiquity, Boethius, who wrote this very important treatise on the consolation of philosophy. I'm not going into this so much, whereas he also laid the foundation of all Western academic studies with, on the one hand, trivium, rhetoric, dialectics, and logic, and quadrivium, which consists of astronomy, geometry, and then geometry and music. And for him, the entire world is framed by music, and only if we understand also the music of the spheres or the stars will we be able to transcend the material limitations and get a sense of the larger universe. Giving us also here a little bit different perspective, Bruce Chatwin, for example, discovered the very, very important so-called song lines or dreaming tracks by the Australian or Aborigines. In other words, music and poetry as the form of identity in a historical and cultural terms are absolutely fundamental for peoples all over the world. Whether we still have those song lines or dreaming tracks today is a big question. I try myself to maintain this through writing haikus regularly in other poems on an almost daily basis. And I would like to give you here a poem by one of the most famous German Romantic poets, Joseph Freiherr von Eichendorff. Well, whereas the sociologist Max Weber had argued that roughly about 1800, the world went through a process of disenchantment, rationality and so forth. We have here plenty of evidence that, particularly because of the Romantics, there was a new form of re-enchantment. And so this is just one short stanza. A song sleeps in all things around, which dream on and on unheard, and the world begins to resound if you hit the magic word. I think it's a powerful statement which indicates that the human language holds the key to the secrets of the entire universe. And whether this is now in religious terms, philosophical terms, aesthetic terms, emotional or esoteric terms, it doesn't matter. But he argued, and I think in a beautiful way, that the human language provides us with a key to a larger universe, to our understanding of where we fit into this large universe. Now, a couple of examples from the early Middle Ages, and then I run through, give a couple of other models until I hit then at the end a few lines from the 17th century. This is one of the oldest poems in the history of medieval German love poetry, Courtly Minnesan, and it is a very simple poem. You can read what it says on the right-hand side. It's an anonymous poem. It's a very sweet little song about love, but that is, of course, one of the most fundamental themes in all of poetry all over the world. So let me just read the Middle High German. You can follow me in an English translation. Du bist mein, ich bin dien. Du bist mein, ich bin dien. Des soll du gewiss sein. Du bist beschlossen in meinem Herzen. Verloren ist das Schlüsselin. Du musst auch immer darin sein. So the expression, love is a matter of the heart, and the two lovers want to come together and stay together for the rest of their lives. And here's a beautiful image of this whole notion of love expressed in form of poetry. This would be another one of the most famous examples by a poet whose name is very hard to pronounce by non-German speakers because the WV and the F are pronounced differently. So Walter von der Vogelweide, but anyway, Walter, and his very famous poem, Under the Linden Tree, where we have a female voice, so the man uses a female voice, and he expresses the feelings of a young woman who met her lover under a linden tree, where he had already prepared a bed for them made out of crushed flowers and grass. She hopes that no one knows what happened under this linden tree. Then she uses a beautiful onomatopoetic phrase, tandaradai, which does not make sense unless you understand it's an expression of love, and then sweetly sang the nightingale. And she expresses then, that's the last stanza, there are four altogether. If anyone knew he lay with me, may God forbid, for shame I would die. And of course, she's singing here to the public. And as much as she then, or the male poet using a female voice, tries to insinuate that this is all private, very intimate, in reality, it explores, of course, personal feelings and the exploration or the experience of love. And of course, then the connection with nature, the nightingale, the classical bird that always represents love. Now, on a very different tone, but again, that beautifully connects us with your talk, Abdul. Here's a early 15th century French poet, Christine de Pizan, the most famous poet of her time, a very, very strong feminist. And here in this very brief stanza, she reflects on the loss of her husband, who had died away a couple of years before. And she expresses here in a very powerful stanza her feelings of loneliness, experience of widowhood, and how much she is suffering from the loss of her most beloved husband. So alone am I, friendless, and so lonely. This goes on for about 6 more stanzas, and is one of the most important expressions. And I think there you can see what poetry does. When a person dies, right, as you were saying, Dr. JanMohamed, then we normally don't want to talk about it. Yet in the Middle Ages, they talked a lot about it. And they used poetry and also imagery in order to bring this back into our existence. Actually, my question to my students when we address this poem and others is, I ask them, when is the best time to talk about death? Well, murmur, you know, and they don't know. I ask again, when is the best time to talk about death? And you know my answer. Now, not tomorrow, not when death is coming. We need to talk now. We need to accept death as part of life. That gives us the freedom you talked about. And now I jump to my last examples. I have a couple of cases, and also that is beautiful in terms of the global connections. I'm presenting here a Baroque poet, Johann Scheffler, also known as Angelus Silesius, the Silesian angel, who wrote very enigmatic, extremely powerful poems, which have deeply influenced modern poets. So you see the date, 1624 to 1677. But you see here also Jorge Luis Borges, who was very impressed by Scheffler, and he made a couple of very important comments. But quickly also, since we heard the other name before, even Martin Heidegger was deeply influenced by Scheffler and his very enigmatic, esoteric, powerful poetry. So the first line is Borges' Spanish translation. La rosa es sin porqué, florece porque florece. The 16th century Baroque German is, die Rose ist ohne Warum, sie blüht, weil sie blüht. My English translation, the rose exists without a why, it blossoms because it blossoms. So kind of an existential exploration. What is essence? How do we find out? And what does nature do? Gertrude Stein said almost something like the same thing, you know, late 19th century. The rose is a rose is a rose. Did she know Scheffler? I'm not quite sure. Here's another example. Scheffler says, and these are now my translations, I know not what I am not what I know. And here comes almost a highly mathematical conclusion, a thing and not a thing, a point and a circle's flow. What can you make out of this? What is he saying here? That is basic geometry. That is fundamental mathematics, if you will, and yet theology as well. The connection between the individual self and the Godhead, the divine, the cosmos, and the little point, the nothingness of the self, and yet we are part of a huge circle that all flows together. Look at the other one. They're called epigrams. I am myself, eternity, when I leave time behind, and I conceive myself in God and God in me. I mean, let this percolate through your mind. I am myself, eternity. How can I leave time behind? What that immediately forces us to think, what is time? And look at even the further, it becomes almost blasphemous. I conceive myself in God and God in me. Now, mind you, this man was a very strong Catholic, actually had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism. and he was closely connected with Franciscans and Jesuits. So how could he say this? Or here, oh man, as long as you are something, while you know, have, and cherish, you have not been delivered, believe me, of your burden. Is this maybe Buddha? Doesn't this sound like the fundamental Buddhistic teaching? Silesius has been very well received in Japan, in India. There are lots of translations. These are thoughts that I don't even dare to explore to the final end because they are so enigmatic, so paradoxical, and yet so powerful that you suddenly can see they draw us in and force us to think about the relationship between our spirit and our body. He dares even to say God is an utter nothingness, beyond the touch of time and place. The more thou graspest after him, the more he flees thy embrace. It's a little bit older translation. What does he say? He's saying, if you try to put God, however you want to define him, but if you want to put God into time and place, he's gone. Because time and place are categories of human life. So the more we try to understand God in human terms, the less do we really have him. So I think I should come to my end. I skipped a couple of slides, and here are my conclusions. So I would like to say that poetry sings from the past to the present to our future. It is the universal music that goes through our veins. It is our basic pulse. It's our blood and heartbeat. And once we connect with that, we find ourselves. So we can and must chime in and listen. Now, that's the odd thing about COVID-19 that forces us all to come back to ourselves. We are sort of stuck within ourselves, and we are suddenly forced globally to listen to ourselves. And that's where I think we discover poetry again. So our task as human beings is to learn how to sing, how to chime into the global symphony, which is really what it is. We are all a human family all over the world. And whether it's medieval or Baroque poetry, or whether it's the poetry of the latest Poet Laureate, it all are notes on the large scale of the global universal symphony. So yes, COVID-19 is with us, but because of this crisis and the self-isolation and the social distances, we suddenly find that the word is always there, and the word is what constitutes us as human beings. That's what makes us as poets, as human beings, to be valuable. And that's what you have my information. Here's my email. I'm also on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, whatever. I would like to thank you all one more time that I could present this. I would very much love to hear back from anyone who has a question. You can contact me however you want. And once again, thank you so much for allowing me to be with you all tonight or your morning. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Classen, for the detour through poetry of almost 1,000 years, and poetry written all over the world, and especially for that final insight into the concept of nothingness, and the concept as it emerges, which has made me personally think of the contribution made by the Middle Eastern religions to the point of doctrine, and the fact that the idea of nothingness controls and gives meaning to whatever there is, to which meaning can be attributed. An idea of the nothingness at the terminal end or in the middle of it, or an idea which I have not yet come across in the Eastern religions in the way it has been expressed so wonderfully in some of the teachings of Paul or of the medieval fathers of Boece, for instance, Boethius, who was called Boece in Latin, a most wonderful person, thinker and writer, a very advanced thinker and an existentialist. Belongs to the cluster of medieval existentialists, which is so important to the doctrine and to the poetry that you have been talking about. Thank you so much, Dr. Classen, for giving us that very wider global view of the survival of poetry. And I cannot allow too many questions, and an inaugural session does not normally have questions out of respect for the speakers, because these speakers are really our teachers. But I still have one or two questions in the question box. And if there is anybody, I would like to bring on one question from the question box, and I would permit just one more question from the board members attending this inaugural conference. So if any one of you has a question, kindly raise your arm, or you can unmute yourself to ask the question either to Dr. JanMohamed or to Dr. Classen.
Anyways, good morning. I don't have a question. Actually, I have been made speechless with such vehement expressions that the professors have made. And there are certain new concepts which I think we have to ponder, like the idea of nothingness that was told. And even for the previous speaker, when they said about, the death, celebrating death. So how can we celebrate death and the concept? So, this was really mesmerizing. So thank you so much. And I really feel honored to be a part of this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Prabha from Orissa. Is there any other question? Yes? Very brief.
I quickly say something in response to that?
Yes, please. Yes, Dr. Classen.
One of the biggest questions for me was when my parents died. First my mother, then my father, and then the big question came, why did they die?
Absolutely, yes.
And I found an answer. They died so that I could love them more and share that love with the world.
That's so very true. That's so very true.
That moves you, catapults you out of your existence, your mundane, banal, trite existence, and throws you out into the world, and you suddenly realize the baton is in your hand. And now you need to spread their love to the next generation.
Absolutely. The same experience I had. And so that's why it really allures me, the subject, right? Thank you.
Thank you as well.
Thank you. And I have just one more question for Professor JanMohamed. It's a question from Northeast India about, it's really a comment about Assam, India. Death anniversaries of cultural icons are marked by celebrations of their creative works. Does it signify a community's attempt to deal with death, both intellectually and emotionally? From IIT Guwahati, Assam, Professor Suranjana Barua. Professor JanMohamed, if you would like to respond to that, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I see the question posted as well. I think celebration of people's lives, their artistic work, etc., is a way of keeping them alive. There's no question about that. I think what I find most ironic in this way, although I don't think of him as an artist, but Martin Luther King, we celebrate his birthday because he became so iconic, because he was killed, right? So he's a great martyr, and yet we every year we bring him back to life and we celebrate his life. So I think that works too. It's a commitment made by certain artists and writers and political activists that keep them alive forever and ever. More specifically, or more generally, I would say what I've tried to articulate in work that I've done is the notion of symbolic death, right? So that there's a dialectical structure of death. There is what Patterson calls social death, which is the condition of the slave, that he's alive, but socially he's dead. He has no social rights whatsoever, or what we would call civil rights. I pose that against the notion of actual death, that it is the possibility of actual death, my desire to avoid my actual death, that allows me to be taken into social death. And if that's a dialectical structure, the synthesis of that is symbolic death. That is the death of somebody who physically dies, but spiritually stays alive. And Frederick Douglass has a brilliant, brilliant take on it when he wins a fight with a slave driver and he realizes the slave driver will not go to the police and will never bother him again. He talks about it as a rebirth, right? In a very different subject position. So I think that's what celebration of writers after their death is about, is a rebirth of sorts. We keep them alive.
Thank you, Dr. JanMohamed. And so now I would like to conclude this session and with a word of thanks for both Professor JanMohamed and Dr. Classen. And we are quite tight as far as our schedule is concerned. And we would now have to move on to the first session. We would rather take a 5 minutes break. And I would ask the operators to pause the session or mute the participants so that we can transition to the first session on the arts, which will be chaired by Dr. Reynaldo Thompson, architect and professor in electronics arts at the University of Guanajuato, Mexico. Dr. Thompson, could you raise your hand, please? Could you wave your hand for all of us? Okay, so the panelists, the speakers for the session could kindly log in to the session one, and with that word of information for the speakers and the listeners worldwide, we have at least 25 panelists and 53 participants right now attending this virtual session, with a countless number of viewers who are viewing this event live through the Rupkatha Facebook page, which has a following of close to 20,000 members worldwide. Thank you so much. Thank you all for making this inaugural event such a great success, and blessings, and wishing you all good health and the strength and the spirit and the beauty of poetry be with you. And we will meet again to listen to all the great speakers like ones we have just heard today. Thank you. Goodbye.